Yeah.
Welcome to this session, Gaming the Manosphere, Misogyny and Technology in Digital Ecosystems. I'm Professor Stuart MacDonald, and I've already introduced myself, so I won't do that again, but I would like to introduce our three panelists. First of all, immediately on my left, Dr. Florence Keane, who works for Extract as the Head of Programme on Domestic Threats and Programme Manager. And next to Florence is Emily Thompson from the Christchurch Call Foundation. Emily is an international expert in far-right extremism, terrorism and prevention. And at the end is Kate Scott, who is a PhD candidate at the University of Sydney, focusing on de-radicalisation within the Manosphere. So thank you very much to our three panelists. They will each be presenting for about 20 minutes. And after the three presentations, there will be some time for Q&A and discussion. And I'd like to hand over now to Florence.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's amazing to be here in Melbourne, first time here. A lot of coffee I've been having, so if I'm sort of talking nonsense and fighting the jet lag, I apologise. But yeah, really excited to be here to talk about, I guess, what is a pretty extreme subject. So I currently work at a company called Extract, which I'll explain a bit about later. But my work specifically for the last few years has involved studying misogyny online, kind of how that intersects with the far right. And I'll be kind of looking at the incel community specifically, as that's my kind of big background research, but also looking at today, how it's kind of evolved into really kind of mainstream spaces. I think anyone that researches extremism in general, let alone misogyny, will know that it's even easier than ever to just simply open up X or other platforms like that and realize how kind of incredible these algorithms are at pushing us particular content. Inevitably, content warning, I think we all know that over the next few days we'll be kind of exposed to distressing material. So just saying that up front as well. I'll be showing some sample posts from some of the Manosphere and incel spaces as well, which are pretty offensive and sexually violent. I'll briefly run through kind of literature as it stands and then consider some of the ecosystems that I've been studying, at least from kind of the niche to the mainstream. And then I'm going to be using the platform Extract that I work at, looking specifically at a vast amount of data over the past year of kind of curated data in both incel and manosphere spaces to pick out some of the key themes, some keyword analysis, and then dig in deep into kind of what we're talking about when we think about outgroup hatred, specifically misogyny, and the violent fantasies that we're seeing online by these incels. But also some of the other things that really focus their attention. So the idea of purity, kind of policing the incel status, thinking about these core grievances that really drive them, but also places where they diverge as well, because by no means is it this unanimous space. And then finally, just touching upon the mainstream. So what was maybe once something a bit harder to find, we're really seeing in a mainstream way. Cynthia did obviously an amazing job speaking about that just now, of it's not, just what you're seeing online. It's really mainstream political figures pushing these narratives and kind of what that means for us now. I've basically run through what I'm going to cover, so I'll just skip along quickly into who Extract are. Most of you probably haven't heard of it. It's a UK-based technology company founded by a guy called Charlie Winter, who some of you might have met along the way in academia. And we essentially are a pretty small team still of experts, data scientists, engineers, and also people from practitioner backgrounds, so law enforcement, intelligence and government, where what we're trying to do is really focus on the most kind of curated data we can find on these kind of like online extremist spaces. So from my perspective, working in misogyny and far right, I'm basically going around as usual doing my research and trying to get the most important data into the system. So looking at incel boards, chan cultures, but also spaces across X, TikTok, and others, and getting it into the platform so that in real time we can be looking at it using AI and language models to really kind of cut to the heart of all the noise that you find online. And we work mostly with public sector, but also increasingly work with think tanks, academia. So if any of this crosses over with your research, would love to chat more at some point over the next few days. By no means is this an extensive lit review, but kind of useful just to frame where we are right now. So it's not just misogyny, of course, that has been really amplified by algorithms. But what we do know in the past few years is that sites like TikTok, YouTube have these incredibly powerful recommender systems, which really pushes users, particularly young men in this case, towards more misogynistic incel content. From my personal experience as a researcher, I only need to open up X or TikTok. The algorithm thinks I'm a young man that hates women, that very much loves the far right. And it's really all I'll be getting, both seeing the sort of shaming of women, the use of Gen AI, that kind of meme culture as well. It becomes quite inescapable once the algorithm thinks it's figured you out. And what we know is that the way the platforms are designed, so short form, audio, hashtag culture, are particularly suited to getting on really young users. So that visual aesthetic lowers that barrier to entry. And for all of those in the room that study extremism, being able to create that kind of in-group, out-group mechanism is something that's so critical to that extremist mindset. And it's existed long before the internet, but particularly at the moment, some of these platforms and the way they're designed are just so good at really quickly kind of getting people to that point where they're feeling these in-group grievances. As mentioned already this morning, some of it starts off as innocuous and some of it might even be innocuous, right? Self-help, jokes, looks maxing, the term often seen in incel manosphere spaces. So how to kind of make yourself more attractive to women, how to maybe, increase your salary. Not all of it bad, but often underneath that and belying it are more extreme messages about gender roles and other things. So it leads to this sense of desensitization that when these kind of more extreme narratives are being pushed, people are all kind of already in there. They already sort of trust the people that are delivering these messages. Past few years, of course, there's been less of a focus on human moderation and more kind of using AI to actually do the moderation itself. But what we know is that these systems aren't always neutral. They often miss that kind of nuance of abusive behavior that may be targeting women and other minorities. And I'll show a few examples of that in a bit. Well, also Gen AI itself can be a harm multiplier. So abuse, in this case, that overwhelmingly targets women. And it's intersectional as well. So it's not just women, but non-white women in particular, or women from other minority groups will be disproportionately affected. So it really, I think, again, I'll probably keep citing Cynthia because so much of what she said this morning really resonated with what I'm going to say, but that kind of pushing women out of public life, even as someone that was in academia myself, all it took was for me to have a few kind of hate comments online after speaking in public and appearing in public, for me almost to shift how I work, because I found it quite hard as a young woman to tolerate it. And I think it's that kind of quietening of public life, again, that now with new platforms and algorithms, that it makes it even easier, I suppose, to abuse women. And these have real world implications. Even just like brief studies among Gen Z women, almost half experience unsolicited pictures, over 30% hate speech, and just under that, online stalking. And again, I'll kind of talk about that as relates the incel culture. The ecosystems themselves are broad. My background in academia was studying the kind of chans and forum space, and it's still a place that I sit on and I look at a lot. So incels.is, incels.in, looksmax.org, and some other more niche subcultural places. But really what I'm seeing today is you don't necessarily need to go onto these more niche spaces to find the abuse. So X, particularly looking at you, that complete lack of moderation since Musk came into power there. We see this huge growth in misogynistic communities, faceless accounts that reshare really kind of misogynistic content, but sort of sexual shaming of women, women taking L's. It's really prolific. TikTok and Instagram do have some moderation practices. So there'll be certain keywords that you search and it then won't lead you to the right place because it has a block on it. But these are also really easy to evade. And I've got a screenshot that I just took a couple of days ago that was very easy to find. Those of you familiar with the incel space will recognize Elliot Rodger, who was the kind of first quote unquote incel shooter in 2014. And this TikTok account describes voids. So that's the kind of slur used for women, which often then can evade those kind of moderation practices. They talk about total void death. It seems to be in a kind of video game perspective. So -6 voids, meaning 6 women killed. And along the side, you won't be able to read this, but the user is called Void Raper 47, so woman raper. But again, it's those nuances that potentially these moderation practices aren't picking up. And in the hashtags, it then says satire, obviously. Well, to those researchers that know what they're looking at, we know, well, this isn't actually satire. This is someone kind of glorifying violence against women, but it's in a video game. And that's the kind of thing that is much harder to remove. And it's these kind of channels that young people are sitting in and slowly getting desensitized. And of course, gaming communities as well, as has been mentioned. I know we've got people on the panel who've done extensive research into that, so I won't go into that in any more detail now. So looking at some of the data that I have worked on over the last year, so that is actually a screenshot from the platform that I work at, which is looking at a sort of topic model of about 15,000 posts from the incel and kind of manosphere adjacent communities. And I think people won't probably be surprised by some of the key themes coming out: misogyny and gender dynamics, rife. So of course, anti-feminism and these really kind of violent fantasies that people play out online. These communities are obsessed with aesthetics, looks, physical appearance, really going into such granular detail about what it means to have this ideal male aesthetic. And there's a kind of contradiction there as well, because on the one hand, they hate women, but on the other hand, kind of deeper than all of that is maybe this desire to look a certain way. And if you don't look a certain way, there's no way of kind of rising out of this genetic hierarchy. Self-loathing, obviously huge. And there's a lot of content on there which talks about sort of suicide, a deep sense of nihilism, and battles as well between what makes an incel, what makes the sort of truest incel, which I'll talk about briefly. They talk about mental health quite a bit, which can often be supportive, sometimes not so much. Sometimes they're encouraging each other to hurt themselves. But occasionally when it does seem like there's a more sort of serious risk to someone self-harming or maybe even committing suicide, there is a sort of supportive mechanism that comes into place there. Dating, a huge one. So that perspective on what it is to be a man trying to date in the modern world. And many of these individuals really believing that they've kind of been out of time. If they'd been born, 50 years ago when women did not supposedly control the sexual marketplace, they would have had a much better chance at really having a happy life. And just finally, I'll touch upon the kind of black pill, but I won't go into that in too much detail. But it's this kind of part of incel culture that not all incels believe, but really taking the black pill is often a recognition that because they don't look a certain way, there's nothing they can really do to kind of alleviate themselves from this kind of bottomness of the social hierarchy. And some studies have shown that those incels that identify as black pill incels are the ones that are more likely to go on and commit violence. This graph right here, again, you won't be able to read much of it. This was something I just made the other day, which again looks at that year across the kind of incel and manosphere space. And I just did a Boolean search of some of the most key slurs amongst kind of incel and misogynistic communities. So void, I've mentioned, toilet, that's a big one, roasty, and others that I won't say out loud. But you can see that basically on any given day, that's not going under about 3,000 mentions. And this is just in the data that is curated into the platform. So by no means would that even be comprehensive. But I think it simply shows the scale of this kind of normalized misogynistic anti-woman rhetoric. So on the kind of misogyny and violent fantasies, and it's important to say, of course, the majority of these people won't actually go on to commit an act of real world violence, but it's still, I think, critical to think about how violence online is still violent and can still be very, very incredibly harmful in the way in which it normalizes things. So women and girls described through the lens of rape, humiliation, torture fantasies, dehumanization, so labeling them as sort of subhuman or animalistic objects. And as I mentioned, racialized violence and intersectional hate. So while all women might be the subject of abuse, as a white woman, for me, it would be far less. And that's really something I've seen tracking throughout my research, but something that with the kind of more algorithmic sway today is even more easy to kind of spread across ecosystems. That idea of hating interracial relationships and also minorities of other aspects. So LGBTQ, as you can imagine as well, is something that's incredibly demonized and spoken about in very violent terms online. And this violence is often celebrated, not always, but what we see is when there are these fantasies of violence and retribution, often past attackers will be glorified, sanctified, and increasing examples of incels sharing their own stories of real-world harassment, so stalking, manipulation, sharing tips on how to dox women, to kind of publish their details online as well. But as I've mentioned and has already been mentioned, this is often framed as satirical. So the use of memes, irony, within all of that, it's kind of mocking and degrading women. But again, they often kind of avoid moderation, or they kind of excuse themselves by saying, oh, it's satire, or, I want to kill a bunch of women, but in a video game, or in, insert video game name here. So that's kind of a real tactic of lowering that barrier to entry as well. And I've just got a few screenshots here. Again, I'm sorry, you probably can't read these, and I don't really want to do a live reading of them, but the figure on the left is an incel fantasizing about wartime and almost glamorizing war, because if an incel manages to get drafted, he says pretty much anything goes. People rape all the time and they get away with it. 5-minute warning. Okay, that's gone really quickly. Some of these slides might get shared, so I won't read all of them out, but really extreme violent fantasies, torture, listing how they would torture a woman, but also listing how they might abuse women as well. I'm going to skip through some of these, but this slide digs a bit deeper into some of my PhD research, which it looks about the kind of purity and hierarchy debates among incels. So kind of what makes the truest form of incels. And actually, unlike a lot of extremist ecosystems who are almost like fighting for status by being better, to actually gain status in these spaces, it's almost like being the most incel, being the most kind of disgusting, kissless, hugless, handholdless virgin, as they would call themselves. Again, I'll skim over this, even though it is pretty one of the more dark and serious bits of my research, but debates they have around the age of consent. So how young would you have sex with a woman? Would you have sex with a woman of 10 to 12? Quite disturbingly, in self-polling, about 20% of them said yes, although it was a very small poll. And they talk also a lot about sex work as well, and the potential use of sex work to alleviate inceldom. But I want to end on just thinking about the mainstream. So I know I've been quite focused in on the incel spaces themselves. But what we're really seeing, and I've got a few screenshots on the side, are these kind of manosphere influencers. So Darius M is a big one, Myron Gaines, who runs the Fresh and Fit podcast, and Richard Cooper as well, being big names. You can see in the middle that Myron Gaines has got Nick Fuentes on his podcast. And here it's less the kind of really specific violent fantasies that we might be seeing incels share, but it's that focus on really believing that female control the sexual marketplace, and really trying to degrade and shame women sexually. So a trend I'm really seeing is these men getting really young women on their podcast, often half their age. They might be, OnlyFans, women who work in the sex in sex work, and they really just use them to come on their podcast and sexually shame them. And it feeds into this idea of high value men versus low value women. And that rise in traditional values as well. And again, as I've been saying, YouTube, X, and TikTok's becoming increasingly a place of limited moderation allows this content to spread really rapidly. And final thing I'll say, and I haven't done loads of research into this yet, but I'm seeing it in my day-to-day job, is misogyny kind of disguised as protecting women and girls. And I think this is the thing that I'm seeing that has frustrated me the most, having spent about 6 years studying misogyny, is the kind of architects of misogyny are now coming out and saying, oh, look, a woman gets killed. This is because of feminism. So I think the big case, Irina Zarutska, the Ukrainian woman that was killed a few months ago, you got people like Andrew Tate and his cohort saying, this is what happens when you let women get into power. And it's like, pick a lane, Andrew Tate. Do you spend 5 years or 10 years kind of degrading women and talking about them violently, to then say, oh no, but we're actually here to protect you? And crucially, that is white women as well. And we're seeing that really specifically in the UK. If any of you are following events there, the sort of wave of anti-migrant sentiment and protest that has been coming out of there. So whenever there's a violent incident, even if that's not attached to anyone of a migrant status, immediately it is, this is white men are the only people that can protect us. That quote there, meet the Huntington Train heroes, no women, all straight white men. which actually wasn't true because the key person that got in the way of this random stabbing that was a British man was an Algerian Muslim man. And that was something that obviously the misogynists ignored. So I just kind of want to leave it on there, which is for me, at least, a thing that I want to kind of keep exploring, which is that weaponization of kind of, we're protecting women and girls, but underneath it remains this same really sinister misogyny. So I'll end there, but I'm looking forward to questions afterwards.
Okay, many thanks to Florence for that presentation, giving us really quite a rich insight into Inceldom Online and drawing on a really rich data set. I'd like to now hand over to Emily for her presentation.
This is it. I think that's good enough. Yeah. All right. The suspense has built. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this morning to have a rather challenging discussion, but hopefully by the end of this presentation, I will leave you with at least one project that might provide some optimism moving forward. Today, I'm sharing the findings of a paper that will be published hopefully next year that I've worked on with my co-author and colleague, Galen Lamfair England, as you can see is not in the room, but is here with us in spirit. So I'm going to be sharing some work we've been doing on looking at sandbox experiences of VR games with a focus on the lens of violent misogyny for the purposes of today's presentation. And this is an expansion of a project delightfully titled the Extremist and Terrorist Games Database. Today I'm here representing the Christchurch Call. Hopefully, as many of you know, the Christchurch Call is an initiative that arose out of the live-streamed terrorist attack that occurred in Christchurch, New Zealand in 2019, resulting in the murder of 51 people and injuring 50. It was live-streamed online on Facebook for 17 minutes and really set a new precedent in the way such attacks would be conducted in the future. Now the Christchurch Call is the Christchurch Call Foundation, and we are a collective of governments, civil society organisations, tech platforms, and other concerned stakeholders who are working together to eliminate violent, extremist and terrorist content online, but also aiming to preserve a free, open and secure global internet. And finally, the Extremist and Terrorist Games Database is a project of the Extremism and Gaming Research Network, which aims to uncover how malign actors are using gaming spaces, but also to build resilience in communities to online harms and discover new ways to use gaming for good. So that's all the acronyms out the way. Before I proceed, just a heads up, this will contain hateful and harmful content, including mentions of violence. So a little quick overview of the video gaming industry. It is now more profitable than music, film, and television. Around 1 in 4 people play video games, and nearly half of that population are women. Gaming is more than just entertainment. It's a pro-social, positive experience. And to debunk a common myth, there is no definitive connection between the depiction of violence in video games and offline violent behavior. However, the connectivity that gaming platforms offers also brings risks for other social harms, including the exploitation of platforms by violent extremists and terrorists. This occurs in a number of different ways. primarily through the exploitation of video games and modifications, which are changes to video games that folks will make to add new content or to alter gameplay. We also see this exploitation happen through the use of gaming adjacent platforms and games for communication, fundraising through gaming mechanisms, and the use of gaming references and gamification processes to recruit and propagandize for extremist causes. Since the 1980s, terrorists, violent extremists, and targeted hate actors have been creating and exploiting video games and gaming adjacent platforms. And so last year we published the Extremist and Terrorist Games Database, which is the first published effort to create a consolidated database of all that content. It includes games, mods, and now user-generated content as well. We have approximately 350 entries that date from 1982 to the present day, and within that, 60 are categorized as violent misogynist. Our database is being used to help researchers, policymakers, governments, law enforcement, and tech platforms better understand how their services are being utilized in order to help them build more resilient spaces. So I'll just quickly cover this. This morning, Cynthia gave a phenomenal kind of overview of this work. But in relation to gaming, we know that misogynist narratives are prevalent across online subcultures, as Florence talked about, particularly in incel forums, also in men's rights communities, but also in video gaming spaces. And video gaming spaces can kind of act as an entry point into bigger extremist ecosystems. We know that early exposure to online hate and like social grievances can make boys vulnerable to misogynistic and extremist recruitment. Misogyny fundamentally entwines with the manosphere, where we often see misogyny, male supremacy, and a narrow definition of masculinity being promoted. Young men who are depending on content from influencers in the manosphere have been found more likely to dehumanize women. We know that support for violent misogyny and gender-based violence can stand alone as a form of violent extremism, but it also lies at the root of many violent extremist ideologies, often confining women to their role as child bearers and limiting their agency. We also know that men and boys are disproportionately both the perpetrators of violent extremist attacks, but also the primary targets for radicalization. And men and boys who support violence against women and girls can be up to 3 times more likely to support violent extremism. So where does this put us in the world of video gaming? Well, for the purposes of our paper, we looked specifically at sandbox and virtual reality gaming. So if we haven't got a room of gamers, sandbox games are open-ended environments that let people kind of explore and operate outside of traditional gameplay structures like missions or matches. Sandbox gaming is not just games, but it's user-generated content. So experiences, worlds, maps, clothing, items, and avatars. And for this publication, we're also going to be talking about mods as part of sandbox gaming, because mods really kind of enable sandbox utilities within standalone games. We have found that sandbox games and mods offer a kind of form of escapism for extremists who feel that newer games are being structured around so-called woke diversity narratives. So they use games to create a worldview that really reflects the reality they would like to exist in by removing women, the LGBTQ plus community, and other marginalized groups from their gameplay. In part, this pushback is coming from a misperception in the gaming, in these communities, that the gaming industry is being hijacked by women, non-white and queer developers and the characters that they create. But in reality, a study of 100 games between 2017 and 2021, 79% of those still had male main characters, 54% of those were white, and only 2% were featuring queer characters. We are hopefully all familiar with some of the literature that has explored how virtual reality gaming could be used to promote extremism, whether it's through planning attacks or recruitment or indoctrination. During the research for this project, we found several games that are explicitly created in VR. One called Tyrone versus Cops, which is a racist kind of simulation. And then a misogynist game called VR Secretary Ailey, which I'll talk about shortly. Most significantly for this, we found that mainstream games like Roblox, Minecraft, and Rec Room offer cross-platform functionality. So games that you can play in Roblox, you can also play on your VR headset at home, which is particularly troubling when we're looking at things like simulations of violent extremist attacks that can now be played in VR. And a study from 2024 found that VR gaming is eliciting stronger emotions, higher sense of arousal, increased stress, and lower sense of control than flat screen gaming. So the psychological and physiological impact of playing in a virtual reality game is really offering new avenues for recruitment and propaganda and immersion into those ideologies, but also new ways for extremists to inflict harm on their victims. We've grouped our analysis into several different categories. The first is playable simulations and replicas of extremist attacks, some of which I've shown on the screen there. Marketplaces featuring items you can purchase, which also provides a possible avenue for fundraising. Things like raids, booth, and spray paint games, which I'm happy to bore you with after this presentation, that have been manipulated to promote extremist groups in particular. Content and moderation tactics like changing names to be dog whistles or language that your average person probably wouldn't recognize as something extremist. And then misogyny-specific games, mods, and user-generated content, which is what I'll kind of explore now. In the world of marketplaces and avatars, as I mentioned, these can be kind of bought and sold on platforms like Roblox in particular. And you can sell for in-game currency. That there are services that then allow you to convert that currency. So these are some of the things that we found during our research. T-shirts on Roblox with an image of Nick Fuentes, who was mentioned this morning, with the slogan on a T-shirt, "Your body, my choice." Avatars of people like Andrew Tate and Elliot Rogers. And then other things that are part of this kind of crossover ideology. So weapons from the Buffalo supermarket attack and a flag for the Islamic State on a platform called Rec Room. And to note, many of these platforms are designed specifically for children. So it makes it, I don't know, triply alarming, maybe more. Then we categorized our misogyny analysis into 6 different categories. The first is really looking at how agency is removed from female characters in video games. These mainly center on mods to remove women from combat roles under titles like Females Don't Fight, and relegating women in video games from leadership positions into non-combat roles, or just simply replacing them with male characters. Other mods will replace female narrators with male voices as well, and sometimes they'll use AI technology to do so. Other games and mods and sandbox content are really focused on demonizing women. Revenge on Gold Diggers is one particular example. It was released this year. It's from China. It's a full motion video game available for $6.99 US on Steam. You play as a male character who's attempting to exact revenge against so-called gold diggers who are exploiting men to gain money using honey traps. We use a site called Gamerlytic to estimate revenue. We think this game has possibly generated up to $7.6 million US in revenue, selling about 1.7 million copies so far. There's also a growing evidence base that indicates a link between the use of online pornography and harmful behaviors, violence, and attitudes against women and girls, both online and offline. In video gaming, there are numerous mods available that sexualize and objectify female characters. You have options like jiggle physics, which change the way a woman's breasts are shown in gameplay to sexualize and objectify characters. Others simply just remove clothing from characters, even for underage protagonists like Ellie Williams in The Last of Us Part 2, or even Princess Peach from Super Mario. Then There are also files available for games like Whoreblocks, which is a pornographic version of Roblox available for download from the Internet Archive. We also have had multiple reports of sexual assault being enacted in the metaverse, particularly on Meta's Horizon platform, but also in VR chat and Roblox. There are also mods that will enable sexual assault to happen in video games. So the earliest title in our database is from 1982, Custer's Revenge, which puts players in the role of a white military general assaulting a Native American woman. A Japanese game from 2006 that's still available online lets players play as a man who stalks, assaults, and rapes girls and women. In 2019, a game called Rape Day was shared on Steam, where, again, similar gameplay dynamics focused on harassing and raping and killing women, which thankfully was removed before publication. But even this year, a game called No Mercy was pulled from Steam because it involved incest and rape and offered players the chance to become every woman's worst nightmare. Sales were stopped in the UK and Canada, but it grossed over $50,000 before it was removed. I also mentioned VR Secretary, Ailey Edition. This is a VR game where you step into the shoes of a CEO and physically test the boundaries in VR, assaulting and groping the secretary. Some of these mods feature this crossover or hybridized extremist ideologies with misogyny at the root. We see mods promoting misogynoir, which is the simultaneous oppression of Black women based on their gender and their racial identity. We also see a similar phenomenon targeting Muslim women as well through mods like for The Sims 4, where you can remove hijabs from the create a sim mode, for example, so promoting anti-Islamic beliefs, but also delegitimizing the religious agency of Muslim women. Others serve to put women into a subservient role within gameplay, so they're reduced to just being child bearers in these fictional worlds. And then we also see the replica of things like extremist manifestos, such as the Christchurch terrorist attack manifesto, where he targets Muslim women and white women, again, reducing their role to child bearers and also demographic changes. I'll just briefly touch on this. The Manosphere and incels is another portion that's represented in gaming spaces. I think most interestingly is simulators on Roblox that basically gamify many of the concepts that we've talked about this morning. So virtual gyms where you can physically level up your digital avatar, engage in processes like mewing, which is a kind of false idea that doing certain exercises will help your jawline develop to be more structured. And again, these are aimed at children aged as young as 5 and have been accessed hundreds of thousands of times. So to end on something a little more positive, unfortunately, we can see that these spaces are being exploited. It doesn't mean that video games themselves are a negative thing, but what they do is reflect the trends that we're grappling with in society and provide new avenues for young people to be exposed intentionally or unintentionally to this material. So at the Christchurch Cool Foundation, we've created a prototype resource and curriculum called Level Up Safely, which is aimed at parents, caregivers, and other caring adults to really help them understand what is going on in the world of video gaming, how games can be exploited, but also, like, fundamentally, as Cynthia was saying, like building their knowledge so that they feel more confident and then are able to instill more resilience in their young people. So even simple things like, what is a video game? What is Roblox? What should I be concerned about when my son's got his headphones on in his bedroom? All those sorts of things go into it. We're looking at it from the perspective of online harms. So violent extremism and terrorism is part of this. So is violent misogyny as well, but also other factors that come into play, like doxing and sextortion and some of the nihilistic content that we're increasingly seeing in online spaces. And then building out strategies for resilience. So helping caring adults understand how to have conversations with young people around this content, what resources are out there to provide them with support, with the eventual hope that if we can build more knowledgeable adults, that then they will be able to help their young people navigate these spaces more successfully. So that gives you a sense of some of the things we're working on at the Christchurch Call Foundation. We have all sorts of really interesting projects that will be talked about later in a panel, but if anyone wants to learn more, there's at least 4 of us here, plus partners. You can visit our website. You can shoot me an email, emily@christchurchcall.org. If you're interested in gaining access to the pilot version of the curriculum of Level Up Safely, my very futuristic QR code there will offer you the opportunity to fill out a form, which will go to me, and then I'm happy to share it. And thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the rest of the presentations.
Okay, thank you very much to Emily, and highlighting the role that gaming and the gaming ecosystem plays in mainstreaming the misogyny that we've been talking about this morning. I'd now like to hand over to Kate for her presentation.
Yep, that's right. Right, good. I'm gonna move this to the side. Not a good noise, is it, that? So sorry. All right, hi everyone. I'll throw everything out. Beautiful. Hi everyone, I'm Kate. Like it was said before, I'm a researcher from the University of Sydney. I'm a PhD candidate, so I'm the token academic for this panel, I believe. I'm hoping to submit halfway through next year, so this is what I've worked on thus far. Obviously, it's not entirely finished or polished, but hopefully it's interesting enough to keep those of you who are jet lagged a little bit awake, okay? Before I start, I do just want to take a moment to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land that I live and work, which is the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and the traditional owners on which we are today. I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. Now, I know Cynthia and my fellow panelists have spoken at length on online misogyny. I'm just going to preface my research by talking a little bit about what exactly is the manosphere and the red pill as this research understands it. So traditionally, we know the manosphere is this very informal confederacy of online anti-feminist groups. So obviously, we've heard in depth about incels, involuntary celibates, men going their own way is another group, pickup artists, men's rights activists, among many others. However, it's important to note that as the manosphere grows and develops alongside gaming and social media, it's becoming increasingly decentralized and dispersed in its ideas. Language, behavior, ideas are being adopted, co-opted, and popularized. And whilst the philosophies and languages and behaviors of each of these groups are somewhat distinct, they all generally share the opinion that feminism, woke politics, and current gender relations alienate, victimize, and subordinate men. This belief is often referred to as the red pill, and I will be referring to it as the red pill throughout this presentation. And this draws from the 1999 film The Matrix, where the protagonist is offered 2 pills, one being the blue, which offers this blissful ignorance, and then, of course, the red, which is this revealing of this alternate truth that will change your life. And today, with the red pill and the manosphere, that is that kind of idea that woke politics and current gender relations are victimizing men. So with this perceived attack, this perceived subordination, how do these manosphere participants really respond? And that's often with violence. So we have acts of both physical and psychological violence. Most famously in 2014, we've spoken a few times about Elliot Rodger. That was a self-proclaimed incel that instigated a shooting spree in California in the US, which resulted in the deaths of 6 individuals and the injuries of 14 more. So that was before he took his own life. Since then, many online communities have lauded him as a martyr, and there's been quite a few copycat attacks in the decades since. We've also seen a lot of psychological violence, including doxing, swatting, hacking websites, Wikipedia pages, sexual harassment, assault, death threats, utilizing graphic porn, both real and generative. And it really kind of influences how women are able to operate not only online, but in real life. So I'm actually delighted that we had Cynthia speak today, because often when I talk on panels about countering violent extremism or terrorism, a lot of people shut off because it doesn't make sense for a lot of people that misogyny or sexism falls within the guise of violent extremism or terrorism, right? It's often couched within white supremacy, far-right violence, even Islamic violence. It's often a secondary, tertiary consideration when we talk about violent extremism and the motivations behind it. Incidents like that 2014 Isla Vista shooting and the 2018 Toronto van attack and many, many others underscore the integration of misogynistic ideologies into acts of terror. Yet media, scholars, practitioners, they often focus on other motivations. So mental health, white supremacy, religion, and this is pretty shocking because we're seeing the casualties, those numbers rise. When I last looked at the data, it had risen to over 120 casualties with over 60 fatalities in the past 10 years directly tied to the manosphere. But as Cynthia mentioned, it can be really difficult to kind of identify what is explicitly tied to, what is implied to, because it's not considered. And even within scholarship on incel violence, there's this hesitation to perceive sexism or misogyny as a political ideology and one that could lead to violent extremism and terror. There's this really great article called Assessing the Threat of Incel Violence, assessing the terrorist threat of incel violence. And even in it, they say the incel worldview is not obviously political. Now, I have some gripes with that, but it kind of showcases this idea that sexism or misogyny isn't inherently political. But we're starting to see this kind of gradual shift in acknowledging misogyny as a form of violent extremism. START has tracked misogyny or male supremacy as a motivation for terrorism since 2018. ASIO actually changed their language to include ideologically motivated extremism and identified incels as a security threat in 2021. But there are quite a few significant challenges when it comes to de-radicalization efforts within the manosphere. Misogyny often falls under this category of other, as Cynthia very clearly kind of mentioned earlier. There's also a lot we still struggle to understand when it comes to radicalization, and counterterrorism measures, which traditionally are like primed for jihadist extremism, really struggle to accurately address the highly digital, unstructured nature of networked misogynistic and terror extremism. So there is this need to keep reassessing this area and take seriously the security implications of violent extremism motivated by misogyny. And that's kind of where my research comes in. This will come beautiful. So I've spoken a little bit about terrorism and including sexism in the narrative. So my research is looking at how do we kind of generate grounded theory that best explains what enables individuals to leave the manosphere, and how can knowledge about these experiences inform CVE policy going forward. So I did that in 2 different ways, one being a netnography, which is a fancy word for being I went on the internet and just looked at a lot of people. Specifically, I looked at people on Red Pill. So this is a online subreddit community that helps individuals who have left the red pill or are trying to leave the red pill. I did initial sampling, including every post and comment over a 3-month period. And then I did a focus coding, used the subreddit's inbuilt search bar and key search terms to kind of source posts that specifically spoke about the de-radicalization process. And that included 92 posts and 4,355 comments. So that averaged about 47 comments per post. And then I did interviews. So I did 17 interviews across 9 subjects, 6 of which were former red pillars, and 3 were practitioners that worked in the healthy like masculinity or youth psychology kind of spaces. And I did initial interviews that were pretty semi-structured, trying to look at formers' engagement and disengagement with the manosphere, practitioners' successes and struggles operating within that same space. And then I looked at focused interviews. So after I'd had time to kind of sit with the data, I wanted to ask some more kind of pointed questions to understand what processes worked, what didn't, what would they do with more money in terms of the practitioners, and also kind of challenging some of the discussions that I was having with the formers. So this hasn't formatted very well at all in the little shared file, but this was some of the initial codes. I won't go through all of them, but we had some key themes like age and development, gender roles and identities, dating, relationships, disengagement and advice, emotions. We also had rationality and data, this idea of doing your research, hostility and extremism. So those kind of discussions of actual like vitriol that was still there, conversations about the self, conversations about the red pill community, sexuality, the subreddit itself, and these kind of digital spaces and what they provide. And I kind of divided my research into these 3 sections. So we're looking at that initial turning point. What's that initial intervention that has turned someone away? It started that cognitive shift. Then de-radicalization, looking at those kind of longer term strategies. What helps, so-called deprogram these very rigid belief systems. And then following that, prevention. How can these lived experiences inform future approaches to preventing online extremism? So looking at that initial turning point, what became very evident among both the interviewees and those as part of the netnography is at the center is the self. The most prevalent kind of conversation around that initial cognitive shift was centered on me, what I did, what I saw, what I engaged with, what I reflected on. We kind of saw this pivot of the intervention, so-called intervention, isn't this inherent external action of someone else or something else intervening. It's rather like an instigating event or process through which an individual undergoes a moral or cognitive shift, recognizing that their beliefs or actions are flawed and potentially harmful either to themselves or to others. So we see this often marked with like a lot of disillusionment with an existing belief system or set of behaviors. So in this case, the red pill, realizing it's not serving them the way that it promised that it would. A lot of individuals talked about how they followed the red pill or they followed the manosphere because it promised this sexual success, this romantic success, or this social success. And for some of them, they lost all of their friends. They failed in a lot of their relationships. They were told you have to be a strong man in the relationship, and then their girlfriend didn't want to be with them anymore. And they got to the end of that relationship and went, well, why did I do that? So having that kind of self-reflection in that space. The next element that was prevalent was this idea of peers. So these kind of like horizontal relationships, close romantic and platonic relationships that reinforce or challenge beliefs through this capital of this social capital. This idea that if you make a sexist joke and your friends go, ooh, I don't know about that, it kind of helps them assess, oh, why did I say that? That wasn't right. Again, you see in both the interviewees and in the netnography, people realizing that they're more socially isolated than ever. And then finally, thirdly, we have the support system. So often when we talk about support systems, it's like a trusted adult, relationships with respected support figures. So family members, educators, therapists, also spiritual advisors. One of the interviewees I spoke to talked about how one of their turning points was speaking to a spiritual leader at a temple, not even a temple that he was intending for spiritual practice. He went there with a friend who was struggling with homelessness, and they went for the soup kitchen. And it was the conversation with the spiritual leader there that really started him down his journey of acknowledging that he was leading with hate rather than love. And that was his kind of turning point, that cognitive shift. And then least present is institutional. So none of the formers that I observed in Reddit or even spoke to mentioned institutions as an effective manner, as an effective avenue for them turning away from the manosphere. So I have institutions applied relatively loosely here, so formalized and structural interventions. So that can be like carceral systems, but it can also be school, employment kind of institutions. So it's usually due to an individual being identified as a threat or engaging in harmful behavior, and it results in legal, judicial, or employment-related consequences. And in talking to the formers, one individual who received quite a bit of employment backlash said that it actually reaffirmed his engagement to the manosphere and to those narratives because it reaffirmed that he was a victim. Whereas talking to the practitioners, particularly one who worked with school-age children, she spoke about how engaging in these kind of institutional infrastructures were the only way to kind of communicate the consequences that come across. So this idea that if you have, deep fake pornography on your phone, or if you have nudes of a girl on your phone and you want to leak it, that can have legal ramifications. And that was one of the only ways to have these young boys take the consequences seriously. Kind of, appealing to the empathetic nature of them wasn't getting that point across. So we have institutions there because that kind of legitimacy that it affords can have some sort of avenue, but it isn't as the top-down approaches that we kind of have this familiarity with. I am aware that I have 5 minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about de-radicalization. We had 4 key areas when I talk about these longer-term de-radicalization and disengagement strategies. One being developing a life outside the internet. So hobbies, community social groups, talking to women in person. A lot of the things that your parents will say, go outside and touch grass, is here. So support system, having a home life that really reaffirms these positive attitudes, exercise, hygiene, religion, spirituality, and philosophy, also key elements that came up here. Also, in terms of having a community and having that social group, race was a really important element here. A lot of young men talked about how if they were a racial minority, feeling isolated or victimized because of that was really hard. And it was engaging with their roots that really helped them see like the value in that. There was also a conversation around substitution and alteration of social media, replacing influences and content with non-red pill content. However, a lot of them spoke about how this had to be self-directed. Top-down interventions like content moderation, the closure of subreddits, for example. I had one interviewee who said it just radicalized me 10 times because it also does funnel them into more unmoderated sites. But yeah, there's this idea that we have to emphasize, algorithms, media literacy, putting forward positive male role models, and allowing/equipping young men with the ability to block, clear caches and cookies and delete accounts if needed. There was also a conversation around accountability and emotional regulation. A lot of young men talk about starting therapy. There was quite a lot of individuals who talked about their neurodivergence and how they had to really take a minute to dismantle binary thinking. Emotional regulation, anger, rejection sensitivity, self-responsibility versus the external locus of blame, and moving beyond cynicism to this empathy. And finally, I have down there dating. This also includes just general relationships with women, having some self-respect, which sounds quite aggressive. But this idea of not settling for unrequited relationships, having consent as both an empathy and legal issue, as I mentioned before, and setting realistic expectations. There's also been quite a few criticisms of the ascension narratives that once you have sex, you're fixed. You're no longer an incel, you're no longer part of the red pill. You've ascended, essentially. But it doesn't really dismantle the underlying logics that reaffirm that ideas. Beautiful. I'm aware of the time, so I will kind of very briefly go over this. Essentially, when we talk about informing prevention, a lot of conversation is, why do men join the manosphere? I'm sure everyone here will have heard one of these kind of, buzzword phrases: male loneliness epidemic, masculinity crisis, lost boys generation. They are facing quite a few sociocultural issues, as I have done there. But it is also important to understand what the manosphere provides in the face of all of that. So it provides a lot of community. It's very effective in utilizing the digital. It adapts so quickly. And it also provides a very clear pathway. It was mentioned, I believe, briefly already, this idea that the manosphere gives you a step-by-step guide on how to live life and how to succeed. However, it has a very narrow view of what success actually looks like. And for some men, it is that very clear definition of what a real man is, of what success looks like, that helps them kind of set up their expectations in a way that's very easily quantified. And you don't see that as easily when we talk about positive masculinity. What does a good man look like? For a strong man, it's very easy. You have a lot of money, maybe you have a yacht, you're ripped. We don't have as clear a pathway on the other side of that coin. So having that kind of conversation is also very important for informing prevention. And with that, I might stop so that whoever's keeping time can actually take a breath out and turn to questions. But thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you to Kate. Lots of interesting things there arising from some quite unique empirical research and interviews. So thank you very much. We have about 13 minutes for questions, and I'm sure there are lots of questions in the room. Michelle was first to put her hand up, so we'll begin with Michelle.
Thanks very much, Stuart, and thank you to all. Hardly see you here. Thank you to all three of you. Look, my question is for Florence, but I'm happy for any of you to take a crack at this. Florence, when you talked about was it kissless, hugless, and hand-holdingless, and I thought, that's not really about sex and women. It's about mummy, right? It's about mothers. That's about, I want my mum to kiss me and hold my hand and hug me, which led me to, this is now the question. What is the role of male vulnerability here? Because so much of this can be read as a kind of resistance to or denial of the fact that men are vulnerable. But as women, we are gendered into understanding our vulnerability, which paradoxically can often make us more resilient as women. Yeah. But men are often taught to deny that vulnerability. Would socializing men into vulnerability as a legitimate experience make a difference in this poisonous sort of sphere?
Yeah, thanks for the question. Yeah, the KHHV acronym is an interesting one. I think, yeah, I'm sure there's much research to be studied about that relationship with the mother. We know actually that some of the violence committed by people that are adjacent to incel communities, actually often the first target is the mother. We saw that with Jake Davison a few years ago in the UK. I think what's interesting about maybe comparing actually the incel spaces to the more kind of red pill spaces we heard Kate talking about is actually they can be incredibly vulnerable, which is somehow a bit of a paradox. The red pill on the one hand is being really strong and not showing your vulnerability, not crying. A weak man is someone that sort of bears all of that. And actually the incels, although anonymously, are incredibly vulnerable in a sense of saying, I am feeling all of this despair and all of this loneliness. I've never been touched. I've never held someone's hand. That vulnerability then doesn't necessarily, or most often doesn't go into that maybe more healthy space where men are able to healthily kind of express that. But certainly I would agree with you. I mean, the more we can get young boys able to be more in touch with those feelings and not seeing that as a weakness and not seeing that as something that is feminine, I would hope is a way out of it. But yeah.
I'd just add that in video gaming spaces, I think one of the great kind of positive pro-social aspects is a lot of boys and young men report that this is where they feel they can be themselves and share vulnerabilities that otherwise they would keep to themselves. So in terms of interventions and off-ramping, video gaming provides one of those great avenues where vulnerability can like be championed and harnessed for good.
Yeah, I might echo what's been said already, but I think in these spaces, the anonymity of these spaces allows a lot of these young men to feel vulnerable. And I think it's actually the transition into real world spaces where that's where that disconnect is, that's where that kind of barrier is. When I spoke to young men who were disengaging, quite a few of them said, you're the first person I've spoken to about this. No one else in my life knows that I went down this rabbit hole or I spoke about these things or I had these kind of engagements. Some of them would say like friends knew, like they had an inkling. But I think, yeah, these online spaces, another reason why they are so effective is because they allow that space to be vulnerable in a way that a lot of young men struggle to find those spaces face to face. Yeah.
There's a question. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you. Oh, so hi. My name is Angus Lindsay. I'm from the Department of Internal Affairs in New Zealand. I just first of all want to give you a big ngā mihi nui and a big thank you for doing the work you're doing. I did a bunch of work on incels around 2018 to 2020. So really happy that someone else is taking this forward and doing some amazing work. So my question was, so there have been a number of shooters, such as mass shooters, such as the Plymouth shooter or the Antioch high school shooter, who had a deep engagement with the black pill ideology or incel ideology, but also other adjacent ideologies and different forms of grievances, and also a really deep engagement with extremely violent content. So my question is, could you guys speak on this, if you're seeing this cross-pollination in ideology and also the engagement with extremely violent content in each of your research? Thank you.
Yep.
I'll start, get the ball rolling. Yeah, I think it is very interesting to see how misogyny intersects with a lot of different types of grievances, like you said. One of the interviewees I spoke to is a white passing Maori man, and he spoke about how his indigeneity almost allowed him to engage with white supremacist narratives more effectively. So he identified as a white supremacist at the same time that he engaged in the red pill and the manosphere. And he talked about how being, having this indigeneity behind him, he felt better presented and better placed to kind of have grievances against like immigration and things like that. And that's why he felt kind of compelled to engage in white supremacist spaces and neo-Nazism. But at the same time, he felt that misogyny and sexism really clearly intersected with that. And we heard from Cynthia today this idea that misogyny and sexism isn't something that's only perpetuated by men and isn't only the target of male supremacism. Women play a significant role. Female reproduction has a really significant role. And so that kind of enmeshment is very, very apparent. It's not mutually exclusive in any way, shape, or form. But you do have people who are solely sexist, and there isn't necessarily anything beyond that, at least in my research. But absolutely there is. Yeah. Beautiful.
In terms of exposure to kind of horrific content playing a role, I think in social media spaces for young people poses the greatest challenge. There's a podcast associated with Cynthia's book, which I highly recommend, and in it she talks about there was a day where seemingly like all the barriers came down, and young people around the world were being exposed to highly violent gore content. And it didn't even kind of make a ripple in the news. I wasn't aware of it until I listened to the podcast. I think things like the assassination of Charlie Kirk are a really good example of things that even as a younger person on the cusp of the social media revolution, like I would have had to go out to horrific websites to find this kind of material, and now it's being served up on a plate. So I think there is some like nascent research around desensitization to violent content, and I do wonder if, and the folks who are on the panel about the COM and 764 will probably speak to this more directly, but that interlocking of all these different ideologies maybe comes from a sense of hopelessness about the world that we all currently inhabit and the way our devices are offering up this kind of horrendous content as entertainment. So no direct answer, but some food for thought, perhaps.
Yeah, just briefly, I mean, the 764 No Lives Matter stuff, I think that for me is where all of this stuff really can come together, that idea of violence for the sake of violence. In the UK, we're talking a lot about how do we think about violence fixated individuals. So you might get an attack and then you kind of dig into their background, and you get things that we might understand of kind of typical misogyny stuff, or maybe it's far right stuff, but really just a cherry picking of so many different ideas and ideologies, where it makes it really hard, because we love, as academics and practitioners, we love categories, we love being saying this individual belonged to that subculture or that worldview, and I think that's getting increasingly difficult. The Southport killing that we had last year in the UK of young girls at Taylor Swift dance class kind of did show this background of many different influences as well. And I think my research has looked at incels and the deep kind of nihilism there, but that nihilism, I think, that is really hitting really young people in these movements, where it's often there is an ideological component, but it's simply about that violence itself, and that kind of gaining traction and gaining momentum through that violence. So yeah.
We have time for one more question. Over here, please.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Curtin Montgomery. I'm from the ACT government. So as a CV practitioner and a woman, I know that my voice working in this space, doing intervention, is less likely to be listened to because I'm a member of the out group, which is fair, understand. I was wondering if in any of your research you've kind of seen how people that are coming out of the space, how they can kind of help lead other people. I think it's interesting looking at the ex-Red Pill subreddit to see how people are guiding others out of the space and learning from each other's experiences, and almost providing a little bit more of that step-by-step that the Manosphere does provide people at a smaller scale. So I guess, do you have any experience, insights in that, anything you've seen, even in like the sandbox kind of platform style of games, whether there's like positive ways that people are creating environments? I know it's challenging because they're obviously not as engaging. But yeah, basically any ways out or things to move towards.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and probably the most challenging piece of this. Like, it's somewhat easy, if horrific, to find the content, but then what do you do about it is the real bit that I'm really grappling with, especially in gaming spaces, because as you said, more compelling gameplay tends to focus on darker themes to an extent. I think in gaming spaces, there are organizations and kind of community groups that work together to build safer community spaces where people can play together. So the game itself might not change, but the way people interact through voice messaging and text messaging is a different mentality. It's not focused around raging at each other and throwing slurs out. There are some games on Roblox, for example, that are coming out from like Google, that kind of try to deliver this positive messaging through the gamification process. I'm skeptical as to how many young people would actually like value that. So I think rather than focusing on making like games to, there are some great games that work, like inoculation theory, for example. There's several great games about disinformation that help people understand the techniques that manipulate and change how you think. But in general, I think I'm more of a proponent of creating pro-social gaming spaces. There's a lot of work coming out of Next Gen Men in Canada, who have a Discord server. Discord is a gaming adjacent platform where they bring together something like 1,000 young men to play games together. So yeah, it's you have to do some work to find them, but if you access the Level Up Safely resource, you might find someone's already done a bit of the legwork. So.
I'm going to add to that a little bit. I think when we talk about CVE or countering terrorism, there's a lot of conversation about institutions or schooling or parents. And I do think an area that needs to be looked at a little bit more is this idea of like peer support and these kind of like horizontal relationships, particularly with formers who have gone through it and get it and know what it's like. I think there is this kind of resistance to adults or kind of, you know, these institutions for being sanctimonious or preachy, and it kind of sets up these boundaries, and having someone who has gone through it and can understand balancing accountability with validation, of I understand what you're going through, I understand the fears and anger that you have, but you need to do something about it. I think is really, really important, and it is something that's perhaps underutilized or needs to be looked at a little bit further. Next Gen Men is also wonderful, very interesting, looking at how they kind of meet young men in particular where they're at. So on these platforms that they engage in, and allowing for more kind of organic interactions. When we talk about like the manosphere or online extremism, there isn't necessarily this understanding that you have to go out and search for something and it comes to you. You see it, you're exposed to it. And having that kind of system where people can engage with counter narratives in a similarly kind of organic manner is also an area that seems very interesting and seems to have quite a lot of promise. Obviously, I think just on the basis of this panel and all of the research that's coming out, it is still something that's emerging, and we're still yet to see the longer term effects of how these spaces interact and how they're developing, and how strategies like the social media ban will actually look in practice. But I think there's a lot of promise in peer support and formers and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah, I would definitely echo my experience of that resistance for adults, particularly in this misogyny space. I occasionally go around and speak to sort of teaching unions and networks of teachers who are really grappling with incredibly young girls and boys echoing some of these kind of manosphere incel tropes. And they always say kind of like, what do we do? And I by no means would profess to have any deep answers into that. But my instinct has always been not talking down. The more you can really try and engage with people at a level and say, okay, well, there's a reason why you've got to this place. How did you get here? And can we unpack this almost kind of adult to adult, as opposed to just saying your beliefs are evil and they're wrong and you cannot say them. And that's always been my instinct. But I haven't seen loads of good examples, I suppose, of former incels. There are a few public incels that have come out and spoken about their experience. They are unfortunately immediately very mistrusted by the community, who just show a lot of vitriol towards anyone that has managed to kind of get out of that system. So a big kind of mistrust there towards those. Yeah, not talking down, I suppose, as those kind of adults and trying to engage at that level is probably what I would say.
Thank you. Okay, well, before we break for lunch, I'd just like to remind everyone of the choice of roundtables after lunch. So after lunch, there will be roundtable A, Building Digital Community Resilience, Youth-Led Solutions for Safer Online Communities, or roundtable B, Online Misogyny and Violent Extremism, Insights from Catalyst. But lunch is now going to be served, and it's at both ends, so you can go to whichever end has the shorter queue. But could we please finish by thanking our outstanding panel one more time?